World War II was a brutal conflict that severely affected hundreds of millions of people around the world. The US was drafting millions of soldiers while others were called into wartime support labor, as well as the rationing of food and clothing, selling of wartime bonds, and the planting of victory gardens. Patriotism was high. Many men volunteered, wanting to do what they could to help the war effort. It seems everyone was eager to do their part. So how did baseball, specifically Major League Baseball, survive the war? To answer that question, we need to go further back and look at World War I. When the United States entered World War I, millions of American men either volunteered or were drafted. In January 1917, the Zimmermann telegram was sent to Mexico from Germany, proposing an alliance and promising American land to Mexico. This telegram was intercepted and published in America, and as you can imagine, it caused outrage. America then entered World War I on April 6, 1917. The government was expecting around 1 million men to volunteer, but only about 73,000 men did. They realized that a draft was necessary to preserve American freedom. The previous draft during the Civil War did not go so well. It caused riots in New York City's Manhattan that were so severe, squads from the battlefield were pulled to the city to regain control. The Civil War was much more divisive due to the nature of the war, but another factor adding fuel to the fire was the exemptions of the draft. The wealthy were often able to hire a substitute, leading to the phrase, rich man's war and a poor man's fight. To prevent more riots, Secretary of War Newton Baker and President Wilson chose to remove the option to buy a substitute, leading to the draft to be more accepted. This is where Major League Baseball took its first misstep. During this trying time, baseball owners were complaining about filling out rosters and wanted their players to be draft exempt. Not a good look. But they made it worse by wanting the wartime taxes to be passed on to the fans through admission tickets. Also not a good look, but they made it worse. The players got in a dispute over bonus money and threatened not to play the 5th game of the 1918 World Series. Keep in mind that this was during World War I, where men overseas were fighting in the war in an unimaginable conflict, facing horrors every day. Once again, this did not bode well in the eyes of the public. The very next year, in 1919, was the Black Sox scandal, where the Chicago White Sox were accused of throwing the World Series in exchange for a payment from a gambling syndicate. Thankfully, baseball is a great sport, and even all of these missteps could not keep the sport down for long. And in 1920, the first MLB commissioner was elected, Kenesaw Landis. He was a former judge, and he wasted no time in making changes, banning 8 White Sox players for life, including shoeless Joe Jackson. Fast forward to the 1940s. The MLB entered the 1940s strong, selling about 10 million tickets a year. With the threat of a draft looming, Landis, learning from baseball's previous mistakes, made it clear that baseball would not be seeking any special treatment for its players. In April 1941, the first MLB superstar would be drafted for World War II, Detroit Tiger slugger Hank Greenberg. Overall, the 1941 season operated as normal, but this was before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Sunday, December 7th, 1941, 7:48 a.m. Pearl Harbor was attacked.
Yesterday, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
A total of 2,393 Americans were killed, and the next day, December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan, followed by a declaration of war on Germany and Italy a few days later. Soon after the attack on January 14th, 1942, Landis sent a letter to President Roosevelt asking if professional baseball should continue to operate during the war. Perhaps surprisingly, the president gave a quick reply in what is now known as the Green Light Letter, where baseball was not only allowed to continue, but encouraged. However, the players would not be exempt from the draft, and many would be drafted. To ensure the survival of the MLB and baseball as we know it, Landis had a plan. First was to lean into patriotism, to reinforce the idea that baseball was part of what it meant to be an American. They also wanted to show how much manpower the MLB was sending to the war, through players and umpires. To further boost public image, they also sent baseball bats and gloves to servicemen fighting in the war, and allowed many servicemen to attend the games for free. This seemed to mostly play well to the major leagues, as 2/3 of the public wanted baseball to continue during the war. And even more importantly, 95% of the servicemen supported it and spoke favorably about it during the war. They were able to keep track of the games through the radio and papers. I can imagine it was a reminder of where they came from and the life they were fighting to get back to. To further lift public image, each team would give the ticket money from one game each year. Over the first 3 years of charity games, including All-Star and World Series contests, the majors contributed about $2.6 million to various wartime charities and helped sell over $1 billion in war bonds. Although at times it was questionable which games the owners were selecting, as sometimes it seems that they would intentionally pick a game that they know would not sell well. Either way, it seemed to be a success. Over the course of the war, over 500 major leaguers and thousands of minor league players were drafted into the war. You may think that due to the fame and prowess of these players that they were treated differently than other soldiers. And you would be right. At least some were. The best example of this might be Joe DiMaggio. He traded a $43,000 Yankee salary for a payment of $50 each month when he chose to enlist in the Army on February 17, 1943. Although it should be noted he was in a salary holdout the previous year before the 1942 season. However, when Joe enlisted, he requested to receive no special treatment. When asked how he would like to serve, he responded, "They can put me where they think I'll do the most good. I haven't asked for anything special." Nonetheless, like many other major leaguers, he never saw combat, serving instead in a morale-boosting role by playing on service baseball squads. The purpose of Joe and other big leaguers playing on the military teams was to keep the regular troops entertained, as well as keep public morale high. Joe was stationed at the Santa Ana Air Base in California before being sent to Hawaii, joining the 7th Army Air Force team, where he played against some other baseball legends like Johnny Beasley, Joe Gordon, Pee Wee Reese, and Red Ruffing. While he did have an easy time in the war, his parents did not have it so good. Unfortunately, they were considered enemy allies and were not allowed to leave the area around their home during the war, and were kept from activities that they loved. It has been noted that Joe believed that he had been made an exhibitionist, which he deeply resented. Allegedly, he requested to be put to service but was denied. Despite his feelings, he would play for the 7th Army Air Force team until he was given a medical release from the Army on September 14, 1945. While many players may have had a similar wartime story as Joe, some did not.
That we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
Theo Hodges. 11 days after his MLB debut with the Brooklyn Dodgers, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and was stationed at Hawaii, where he did play some baseball. But in April of 1945, he landed with an assault echelon at Akanoa, where Hodges was responsible for safeguarding and stenographic preparation of highly classified documents through extensive periods of enemy aerial alerts and extensive bombing attacks. He received the Bronze Star Medal for heroism under fire. He would later join the Hall of Fame in the year 2022. Phil Rizzuto, a Hall of Famer with 7 World Series titles, was shipped to boot camp the day after the World Series in 1943. He played baseball for most of his service time, but he did see limited time as a gunner during the war. Yogi Berra. Yes, the 18-time All-Star with 10 World Series wins, more than any other player in MLB history, served in World War II. He signed with the Yankees in 1943, but before he even played a game in the major leagues, at just 18 years old, he put his career on hold to join the Navy. He was a gunner's mate on the USS Bayfield. The ship was headed for Utah Beach in France on D-Day, June 6, 1944. During the invasion, Berra manned a landing craft support vessel, from which he said he sprayed bullets and rockets across the heavily fortified beach fronts before the troops landed. He was hit in the hand by enemy fire and was later awarded the Purple Heart. As well as for his military efforts, he was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation, 2 battle stars, and the European Theater of Operations Ribbon. Now, for the sake of transparency, Defense.gov said Yogi received the Purple Heart, but the ActOfValor.org said he was nominated for it, but he never received the medal because he declined to fill out the paperwork because he didn't want his mom to get a telegram and worry that he had been hurt. Also in 2009, he received the Lone Sailor Award from the U.S. Navy and was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015. Warren Spahn, the Hall of Famer with the most victories by a left-handed pitcher, the Cy Young Award winner, the 14-time All-Star, also saw combat combat in World War II. Drafted in 1942, soon after making his major league debut, he was sent to the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, where he earned the Bronze Star. After the victory at D-Day, the Allies believed the war was all but over. However, on December 16th, with winter just starting to sink its teeth in, Hitler launched a counterattack meant to split the Allied forces in half. The battle that followed was known as the Battle of the Bulge. This was an incredibly important battle, and although the Germans found some early success in the unexpected onslaught, the Allied forces held on and were soon able to push back, setting up the final push to victory through Germany. The 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, the battalion Warren served in, also played an important role at the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, Germany. When the Germans were retreating, they failed to destroy this bridge, allowing the Allied forces to cross in large numbers. The bridge was heavily damaged, and the 276th had the responsibility of repairing the bridge while under enemy fire. During the battle, the bridge collapsed, taking several lives of the 276th. Lieutenant Spahn survived, but he was later wounded at the Battle of Remagen. He was hit in the foot by shrapnel, and although he claimed it was only a scratch, he received a Purple Heart. After returning from service, he would go on to accumulate the most victories by a left-handed pitcher at 363, a Cy Young Award in 1957, appear in 14 All-Star games, throw 2 no-hitters, a 4-3 record in 3 World Series, and be inducted in the Hall of Fame in 1973. Bob Feller. The day after Pearl Harbor, Bob Feller decided to be the first major league player to volunteer. He was only 23 years old and at the peak of his career. He wanted to serve, and he was assigned to the USS Alabama, where he was a gun captain. As part of the 3rd Fleet, they traveled around the ocean, winning back all of the islands around the Pacific. According to Feller, we believed in what we were doing, we worked at it, and we were all well prepared. We practiced at night blindfolded. You practice with your eyes closed. Everything became automatic. If something didn't go wrong, nobody got killed. And it turned out he was right, because the Alabama was the only ship in the 3rd Fleet that took to the Pacific and did not lose a man to enemy action. When he returned to pitch for Cleveland on August 24th, 1945, he had not pitched professionally in almost 4 years. That day, he struck out 12 batters. He was quoted saying, "Being inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame is a great honor. Being invited to the White House is a great honor. But to be able to serve the country under the great leadership we had in Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and with all the people we had behind us, back on the farms and in the cities and in the factories, producing what we needed to win the war, that's the greatest honor. I'm no hero. The heroes never return. We survivors, we returned. The heroes are still there in the Pacific and the beaches all over Europe." While there were many that served and were able to return home, such as Ted Williams, who joined the Navy Reserves to be a pilot, Hank Greenberg, who while trying to rescue the men from a crashed plane, experienced an explosion but survived without injuries, Monty Irvin, who played in the Negro League, the Mexican League, and the MLB, served in the Army as an engineer. He also served in the Battle of the Bulge, and Bob Thurman, who played in the Negro League, the Puerto Rican Winter League, the Dominican Summer League, and the MLB, saw combat action in the Pacific Theater of Operations while serving in the Army. All of these soldiers got to return to the home they were fighting for. However, there were others who were not so fortunate. Operation Overlord was the code name for the Battle of Normandy, now often referred to as D-Day, a brutal conflict with the aim of penetrating Germany's defenses and invading the Germany-controlled France. The British were to land at the codename locations of Sword and Gold, the Canadians at Juneau, and the Americans at Utah and Omaha. Omaha was quickly turning into a disaster, as almost nothing went according to plan. All but 5 of the 32 amphibious tanks sank. Difficulties in navigation caused most of the landing craft to be off target, and the defenses were unexpectedly strong. Joe Pender was part of the invasion that day. A German artillery shell exploded just next to Pender's landing craft, punching several holes in the hull and causing it to take on water. Still 100 yards from the beach, the ramp dropped to deploy the men. Through heavy machine gun fire, the men waded through the water, attempting to make it to the beach. Pender lifted one of the big radio systems, which weighed nearly 90 pounds, and made his way to shore. He was hit by enemy fire. Holding the wound on the left side of his face, he kept moving. The radio equipment was vitally important to be able to radio the ships for naval fire support. Pender knew this, so he turned back, heading into the dangerous waters. He made his way out to the sinking landing craft and retrieved a backup radio and some other items. He then brought them back to shore while avoiding the spray of enemy machine gun fire. He then turned around again and made it to the landing craft again to pick up some parts and code books. As he made his way back for the last time, a machine gunner found his mark, and Pinder was hit several times, ripping open his side. By God's grace, he got up and struggled back to the beach. His fellow soldiers rushed to help him, but he waved them off. Rather than seeking for a medic, he turned to his radio sets to work on getting them operational. While working on the radios, he passed out. Joe Pinder would die later that morning. Joe was able to meet up with his brother in England in 1943. This is the last time they would see each other. Joe Pinder never made it to the major leagues. He pitched in the minor leagues for 6 years, in his last year accumulating 17 wins with a 2.93 ERA. However, today we salute you for your service to your country and to freedom. Thank you, John J. Pinder Jr. Elmer Gideon was a young prospect that was bouncing back and forth between the minors and the majors when he was drafted into the Army nearly a year before Pearl Harbor. He was first assigned to the cavalry, but later transferred to the pilot training program. While performing a training mission in North Carolina in 1942, the B-25 bomber he was navigating clipped some pine trees and crashed into a swamp shortly after takeoff. He suffered 3 broken ribs, but managed to escape. He then crawled back into the flames of the wreckage to save his crewmate. He suffered severe burns all over his body before receiving the Soldier's Medal for heroism and bravery. After spending 12 weeks in the hospital and losing 50 pounds, he was ready to return to service. Before going overseas, he stopped to see his relatives. He told his cousin, "I had my accident. My bad luck's behind me. It's going to be good flying from now on." Unfortunately, his confidence was misplaced. 10 months later, he would fly his last mission. He took off from an airfield in England, along with 35 other B-26 bombers, on April 20th, 1944. They were headed to Esquires, France, a launch site for the V-1 buzz bombs that Hitler was using to attack England. After Gideon's B-26 dropped their bombs, they were taken down by anti-aircraft fire. Gideon and 5 of his crewmates died that day. Although his service to the MLB was limited, his service to his country and to freedom should not be forgotten. Harry O'Neal did not see much playing time in the major league. However, he will be remembered for a much greater service. While fighting in Japan, he received a shrapnel wound and spent time in a San Francisco hospital recovering. He was awarded a Purple Heart, but he felt his service was incomplete. He insisted on going back out to the Pacific. Less than 2 weeks after American soldiers raised the American flag on Iwo Jima, O'Neal was involved in a skirmish to secure the rest of the island. When undercover in a deep crater, his life was taken by a sniper's bullet. While his time in the MLB was short-lived and perhaps easily forgotten, he is remembered for his service in the fight for freedom, and for that we salute you. Susanna wrote in a heartfelt letter to her son's former college football coach several weeks after receiving word of Harry's death. Harry was always so full of life that it seems hard to think he is gone, but God knows best, and perhaps someday we will understand why all the sacrifice of so many fine young men. While more than 500 major league players and thousands of minor league players served, with reports ranging from 2,000 to 4,000, not all of them were able to return home. 2 major league players and dozens of minor league players, with reports ranging from 125 to 178 minor league players, lost their lives in the war. Although baseball mostly kept a good image through the war, there were other challenges. As more major league players got drafted, and even more minor league players were sent overseas, team owners began to turn to players that were too young or too old for the draft, while others turned to 4F players. 4F refers to individuals that were seen as unfit for service, usually due to physical disability. Perhaps the most incredible 4F player was Pete Gray. Pete was 30 years old and missing his right arm when he entered the major leagues. Despite losing his arm in an accident at the age of 6, he played in 77 games for the St. Louis Browns. After Pearl Harbor, Pete tried to enlist but was turned down. When a Philadelphia sports writer named him that year's most courageous athlete, he replied, "Boys, I can't fight, and so there is no courage about me." Impressively, he taught himself to catch, throw, and hit with one arm. Before the war, no one would give him a real shot. But in 1940, he handed the owner of the Brooklyn Bushwicks a $10 bill and said, "Keep it if I don't make it good." He hit a home run in his first game in front of 10,000 fans. He batted an impressive .350 in his 2 years with the team and earned himself a minor league spot. In 1944, he batted .333 with 5 home runs with one arm and 68 stolen bases. He then got moved up to the St. Louis Browns in the major league, where he was not received well by his teammates, but he wanted to prove himself. He wanted to be known as a ball player, not as a one-armed ball player. In his 77 games with St. Louis, he batted .218 and did reasonably well on the field, where he used a custom glove crafted by a Shoemaker that is now located at the Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, pitchers found his limitations and began exploiting them, causing his hitting average to plummet. Although Pete was unable to serve his country overseas, he serves as an inspiration to overcome limitations, and although he may not know it, he helped play a small part in keeping baseball alive and well. As the war continued, resentment toward 4F players began to rise. There was a feeling that if they could play baseball, they could hold a gun or at least serve in the war industry. It escalated to a point where in 1944, the Office of War Mobilization ordered that 4F players be re-evaluated. However, the Commissioner of Wartime Effort allowed the players to play in the upcoming 1945 season. The timing is interesting as they were cleared right after Roosevelt made public comments in support of the upcoming season. Comments he made in a press conference the day after he received the season pass for the upcoming season. As the rosters became more depleted, the Brooklyn Dodgers manager, Leo Durocher, saw a clear answer: the Negro League. While the commissioner was quick to point out that there was no rule against it, there were a lot of other pressures. Unfortunately, many of the owners and managers were against integrating baseball. They thought it was good for business, which is interesting because it is reported that many fans just wanted to see the best players on the field, regardless of race. So not only was it morally wrong, they were wrong that it was good for business. However, due to the pressures, baseball would not become integrated until Jackie Robinson played first base for the Dodgers in 1947, 2 years after the war. No team went bankrupt and no team relocated. However, the Phillies were terrible in the stands and on the field. The MLB bought the team and sold it twice. It should be noted that the Phillies were bad for many years before the war. Most of the teams made money through the war, and the MLB as a whole only lost money in 1943. After 1943, many of the owners would have preferred that the league was shut down. However, this was only stated in private. If they voluntarily shut down, the players' contracts could expire, causing them to lose the power they had over baseball. If they were forced to shut down, the contracts would be frozen. So while many owners privately hoped for a shutdown, that shutdown never came and baseball was played throughout the war. The MLB had survived the war, but the sport of baseball was never in trouble, as it had already become integrated in the culture of Americana, and the war seemed to only strengthen this bond. Soldiers looked to the baseball back home as a distant reminder of what they were fighting for.
Baseball's place in our American way of life has remained steadfast. And through this picture, we want you to know that the crack of the bat, the slide for the bag, and the roar of the crowd still are a part of our America.
Baseball also overflowed out of the MLB diamond, as it always does. Several MLB players were stationed at the Naval Base in Norfolk, Virginia, and baseball games were played on the regular at the historic McClure Field. There were even some cases where a major league team would come out and play the enlisted men. Even the Red Sox came out to play. However, they didn't bring the Yankees. They didn't really need to, because the station Norfolk team at the time had 3 New York Yankees on it, including Phil Rizzuto. These games were played to distract service members from the war, keep them out of trouble, and raise millions in war bonds. These enlisted players were assigned Chief Specialist Athletic Rating, which means it was their job to play their sport. However, this rating only lasted until 1943, as the Navy felt it was too soft. But these were not the only players to swing a bat. Baseball was played at Japanese American internment camps to help through an incredibly difficult time. With armed guards, watchtowers, and searchlights ever present, the internees, men and women, built baseball diamonds, recreated their teams, and formed leagues, bringing hope and dignity to the community. Despite the daily humiliation and despair, baseball brought a semblance of their American life back to them. At the German prisoner of war camps, Americans received shipments from the Red Cross that included baseball equipment, allowing them to form baseball teams at the camps. After the Nazis surrendered, there were a lot of restless soldiers, so the military set up sports games with baseball being the most popular. In Germany, the Nazi rally grounds in Nuremberg were repurposed as a baseball stadium. Swastikas were painted over, the American flag was flown, and peanuts and Coca-Cola were brought in for concessions. The law stated that war vets got to return to their previous job for a minimum of 1 year. However, in baseball it was different. A 30-day training period and 2 weeks of pay is what was given. Some players did make it back onto the field and continued their career with success, such as Hank Greenberg, who hit 44 home runs and had 127 RBIs in 1946. But many did not. Understandably, many players found the conditions unfair and some took it to court. A few were able to get paid through the court, but many did not. The teams in courts claimed it was not a job like others, that the skills eroded over time, and they did not earn a spot on the roster. While this may be true, the training period and the pay seemed unnaturally short for soldiers returning from a war, where they fought for freedom, for the country, and for the things that they loved back home. Things like family, religious freedom, and things like baseball. But unfortunately, this story cannot be changed or persuaded, as it has already been written. In 1945, the last year of the war, set an attendance record of 10.8 million, and a year later it was at 18.5 million. The minor leagues lost so many players to the draft that many of the teams did shut down. However, they did recover quickly after many men returned from the war. They grew from 13 teams in 1945 to 43 teams a year later. The navigations of baseball through the war helped prepare baseball for what many consider the golden age of baseball, the 1950s. But that is a story for a different day. World War II was a hellscape that few escaped from. Some were affected temporarily, with a chance of recovery after the war ended. Some were affected permanently through the loss of family, friends, and loved ones. Then there were those who marched out to battle, to fight for freedom, family, faith, the home they loved, and never got a chance to see that home again. They laid down their lives to preserve freedom for a while longer. The freedom to live, to choose, to thank God for another day, and yes, the freedom to play baseball. Baseball came out of the war stronger than ever, but may we never forget those that fought to make it possible, and may we not waste the freedom that we are blessed with.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory there is no survival. Let that be realized.